This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Dr. Victor Cha is the Korea chair at CSIS and one of the world's leading experts on U.S. Korean relations, as well as U.S. foreign policy in East Asia overall. South Korea just elected a new president, and the United States is sending a delegation to attend the new president's inauguration on May 10th. We talked to Dr. Cha about what changes the new administration might bring about in South Korea, about security challenges and dialogues on the Korean Peninsula between North and South Korea, and about Korean cultural influence around the world, including K-pop music and critically acclaimed films. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information about how to join us and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Monday featuring Tim Carney of the American Enterprise Institute. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
So I want to just jump right in here, Dr. Cha. Did the former President Moon Jae-in have any major successes with foreign policy, or was his tenure maybe something to forget about in that regard?
It's a great question. And with all presidencies, the assessment is never really full until years later. But I would say with Moon Jae-in, he had one big success and two big failures. The one big success is in terms of the summit that he had with President Biden in May of 2021. Which I think all agree was a very good summit meeting. It was, following 4 years of Trump where not a lot was accomplished in the alliance, but the May 21 summit between the two leaders was very good because it reaffirmed the strength of the alliance, took care of some troublesome issues about money that was occurring during the Trump presidency, as well as chart out a path for the relationship going forward in terms of new areas of cooperation like global supply chains, semiconductors, and global health. The two big failures were with regard to Japan and North Korea. In the case of Japan, the relationship went into free fall. It wasn't just the South Koreans' fault, but the South Koreans did nothing to try to prevent it from falling. Broken agreements over history, export controls, threatened to end intelligence sharing agreements with the U.S. and Japan. It was very bad. And then in terms of North Korea, that's the signature policy for the administration. They invested a lot of time and political capital and resources into the summit meetings with the North Korean leader, and unfortunately, it produced nothing.
If you're not maybe familiar with South Korea and the internal dynamics there, maybe you've seen like an article or two in the Western media that's probably pretty short, and it's characterizing this president as a right-wing culture warrior and maybe evoking some images or fears in Americans that he may be similar to President Trump. And they cite specifically his criticisms of feminism. Do you think that critiquing the new president as a right-wing culture warrior is fair? And if so, how should we understand that criticism, considering that South Korea is a different culture, different political entity than the United States, and what right-wing culture warriors here might invoke?
Yeah, so it's interesting because when they call him a right-wing culture warrior, it's really with regard to one very significant issue, and that's gender equality. On other sorts of issues, like, you name it, all the issues that divide the right and the left here in the United States, he has no sort of policies that suggest that he's, far to the right on these issues. But on gender equality, he basically took up the mantle of the Conservative Party in South Korea to sort of push back against the Me Too movement and the focus on gender equality in South Korea. South Korea was famously a very patriarchal society, and a lot of efforts were made for gender equality, for the Korean version of affirmative action, particularly in the younger generations. And there was a backlash against that by sort of younger Korean men who have to serve 2 years in the military, 18 months in the military. It's hard for them to get jobs. So while it is a gender war, at the same time, it's linked to the broader problems of the inability of the government to produce enough jobs for well-educated Koreans. We had this sort of movement. It was a backlash against the Me Too movement. And for whatever reason, the candidate Yoon picked that and the Conservative Party picked that up in the hope of winning votes. It never made a lot of sense to me entirely because, this was a very close election. The undecided vote was very important, and a large percentage of the undecided vote are women. So I just never understood the strategy behind it. So there's that element of it. The other element of it is that it kind of rings of Donald Trump in the sense that, this guy's never been a politician, right? He was a prosecutor all his life. So he's not smooth like a politician and sort of says things. There's no filter. He just kind of says things. And so I think that's why people also, sort of compare him to Trump. I mean, one example of this is he made the decision to move the presidency and the offices of the presidency out of the traditional Blue House, which is the Korean version of the White House. So moving completely off, it would be as if the president chose to move the entire operations of the White House off the White House campus to some other place. And that's what Yoon is doing. Like, he doesn't care. He says he wants it done by the time he starts on his first day on May 10th. So, he's very sort of stubborn in that sense and unfiltered. And I think that's why people sort of see him that way. I should also say that when we talk about conservative and progressive in Korea, it's not really a divide like it is in the United States over things like pro-choice or gay marriage or things of that nature. The primary divide between conservatives and progressives have to do with policy towards North Korea, right? Progressives are much more in favor of engagement with North Korea. That's sort of the big dividing line.
So, Dr. Cha, you mentioned his career as a prosecutor, the incoming President Yoon. And this is something I want to ask you about because it seems to me as though part of his political popularity is his appeal to the anti-corruption sentiment that's very broad in Korea, that there's been so much frustration over the many decades of close relations between and corrupt relations between key Korean political figures and the major corporations that have so much power in Korea. And that Yoon, as a prosecutor, he pursued criminal cases against political leaders on both the left of the spectrum and on the right, that he has these bona fides as an anti-corruption crusader. It seems like this was really key to his political support. I want to ask, now that he's being elevated to the presidency, what new tools will he have? What can he do now that he wasn't able to do before to address corruption? What can he do as president that he couldn't do as a prosecutor? And if he is able to change the rules of Korean politics, how will this change the way that politics in Korea operate?
So the thing about the corruption, particularly when it comes to big business and things, they talk about the cozy relationship between big business and government. And, and that does exist to an extent. At the same time, every time any government comes in and says that they want to, get rid of all the corruption and big business government ties, it's kind of a hard thing to do because if we take like Samsung, for example, Samsung is like 25% of the Korean economy. So what president is going to come in and want to sort of really undermine some of these big companies? Having said that, at the same time, yeah, I mean, I think that, Korea is a fairly new democracy, right? They only became a democracy in 1987. And so the standards with regard to clean politics, clean government are higher, and they're getting higher every time. I mean, one of the reasons why Governor Lee, the losing candidate, lost was because of lots of concerns about corruption with regard to real estate and real estate purchases in the province in which he was governor. So it's a very important component, I think, of any administration's policies, but it's a mixed bag. I mean, I think it really is for them because it means sort of, in a sense, biting the hand that feeds them. And it also means that not only the opposition, but their own people are going to be under investigation for corruption. There hasn't been a presidency in which there has not been a big corruption scandal. And, I don't think this presidency will be any different in that regard. They certainly will talk about, and Yoon will talk about, wanting to root out corruption. And so overall, I think it's a good thing, but it's part of the growing pains of a fairly young democracy.
One area where Yoon's presidency might be quite different from his predecessors is in regard to another topic that you mentioned, Dr. Cha, and that's relations with Japan. You talked about how relations with Japan really deteriorated rapidly under Moon's presidency. And Yoon has promised to try to repair relations with Japan going into his presidency. I remember when the boycotts began, and the Korean people seem to have so much enthusiasm for joining the boycotts of Japanese products that there is still pretty widespread anti-Japanese sentiment in much of the Korean population. So are the Korean people supportive of Yoon's promises to try to get Japanese relations back on track after this point, after years of boycotts and tensions? Are the people really ready for that, and are they supporting those efforts?
Well, we don't know yet because he hasn't started, right? He starts May 10th. So it's a hard question to answer. Koreans love to hate Japan, right? I mean, the two major holidays in Korea are March 1st and August 15th, right? And those are sort of the equivalent of July 4th in the United States. And they're explicitly celebrated as anti-Japan holidays because they remember the struggle against Japan, the colonizer, for the first half of the 20th century. So Koreans love to hate Japan. At the same time, though, I would argue this is the highest cost, lowest benefit policy that Koreans and Japanese could pursue. Because while it helps to reinforce a Korean sense of identity and nationalism, in the meantime, bad relations between Korea and Japan are hurting the relationship with the United States because we want the three allies to get together. It gives more room to North Korea to maneuver. It removes any boundaries on China and China's ability to act with impunity in the region. It benefits Russia. I mean, whenever the three allies are not working well together, that works to the benefit of a lot of other illiberal countries in the region. So I really feel like it's the lowest benefit, highest cost policy. Moon, he's been very forward leaning on this. The Japanese are also quite reticent to improve relations. Moon is like the guy at the high school dance who says, I'm going to dance with you whether you like it or not. Like, I'm going to come and dance with you whether you like it or not. He sent an envoy delegation to there last week. The Japanese prime minister met them, which was a very good sign. And he's going to do everything he can to try to improve the relationship. I'm confident in the sense that I don't think it could get any worse, frankly. The relationship can't get any worse, so it can only go one direction. But it won't be easy. I think that, the history issues are still there. There's still a lot of anger on the Japanese side among the Japanese public. The Korean public is, perennially anti-Japanese. So it's not easy, but, North Korean missile tests, Chinese activities, Russia's activities, these things may force the two allies to have to work together, whether they like it or not.
Well, one area where there could be some cooperation, and I think you alluded to this, Dr. Cha, is through the forum that's called the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is a U.S.-led partnership that also includes Japan, India, and Australia as the key members, the four members that make it a Quad. So South Korea are already participating in this to some extent because of this other forum called Quad Plus. But Yoon has expressed an interest in developing relations with these same countries that are members of the Quad. So there is some interest in whether Korea could become a more formal member of this partnership. Do you see something like that happening? How exactly would closer Korean partnership with these Quad countries look? How formal would it be?
So, yes, I think, Yoon, the president-elect Yoon, has expressed an interest in joining the Quad. This is a change in policy in the sense that the previous Moon government was explicitly not interested in joining the Quad, largely because they were worried about China's reaction. And they were worried about China's reaction because they thought China was important for engagement with North Korea. So for the previous government, it always came down to what would help them with engagement with North Korea. And so that's why they had that policy on the Quad. The United States asked them, floated the idea when they started the Quad of asking them to join. And the Korean response was basically, please don't ask me that question, right? Because they didn't want to say no. The Yoon government feels completely differently about it, right? They think the Quad is dealing with issues like global supply chains, global health, emerging and high-tech industries, protection of high technology from theft. These are things that Korea is a major contributor to, right? It's hugely important in terms of the production of semiconductors. It's the single production hub in Asia for the mRNA Moderna vaccine. It is critical to supply chains, resilient supply chains around the world. So Korea is a major and important contributor to the agenda of the Quad. Now, just because something looks rational and makes sense doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? Politics always gets in the way. And so there's some politics right now that kind of make it difficult for Korea to become a member of the Quad. India, for example, is not interested in seeing the Quad enlarged. Japan is a little bit reticent, in part because its relationship with Korea has been so poor, it is reticent to have new members of the Quad. Australia is kind of on the fence, but Australia, I think, is open to it if the United States is open to it. So we'll have to see. I think they will be much more active in the Quad Plus and in the working groups. Yoon has a summit coming up with Biden only 10 days after he takes office on May 21st in Seoul, South Korea. So if they have big deliverables that they're going to present about the Quad there, that's going to be another good sign. But I think it's to the Quad's advantage to have a country like Korea in it. I mean, the whole idea was Korea was supposed to be part of it in the beginning anyway, the big, important, advanced democracies in Asia. So I think, it may not happen sooner, but it'll happen at some point. And that will be good for everybody. It'll be good for the United States. It'll be good for the Quad members, and it'll be good for Korea.
I'd like to ask you another question about the Quad here, Dr. Cha, that's maybe a little bit more provocative, and that's about the future of the Quad really as itself the focus or linchpin of this strategy. And you mentioned how India are not interested in expanding the Quad. I'm actually starting to wonder if the other Quad members are getting a bit skittish about India itself and about India's place in the partnership. And one of the reasons that I'm wondering about this is a story from mid-April. It was reported that the U.S. had invited Japan to join AUKUS, the partnership that was developed between the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia on nuclear submarines, which also appears to be somewhat expanded to include other topics. This seemed to me to be very provocative because it's almost like the recreation of Quad, but at a much closer and deeper level, and with India excluded. If Japan were included in AUKUS, it would have all the other members of the Quad, the USA, Japan, and Australia. And this all came in the shadow of India's somewhat disappointing response to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So I'm looking at this, even though Japan and the US have denied that the story is accurate. And I'm wondering if maybe there is the possibility that AUKUS will actually supersede and replace the Quad, and that all of the hopes that we had put into the Quad were going to be rebuilt in a parallel instrument. What do you think about that?
So, I think AUKUS has a very specific purpose, right? And it's a very specific military purpose. My personal opinion is I don't think it's a good idea to try to create sort of a NATO in East Asia or in East and Southeast Asia. I don't think it'll work. I mean, countries like India certainly would not want to be a part of that. As you noted, they have a different view on certain issues, Russia being one of them. And so I think this idea of having a combination of some of these smaller, military-based agreements like AUKUS, like U.S. Japan Korea trilateral, those sorts of things, but then also having these slightly larger coalitions of like-minded countries, mostly democracies, not all, but mostly democracies that are dealing with other issues like economic security or protection of the liberal international order. So you have a patchwork of these things makes a lot more sense. It's messier, right? It's not as efficient and it's messier. But Asia is not Western Europe during the Cold War. I mean, they're just two very different places. We're never going to see like a Pacific version of NATO, and we shouldn't try to build something like that. Just to give you an example, if they talk about expansion of the Quad, they say that, maybe Korea, I think Canada has expressed interests, but they think it's very important. Quad members think it's very important for an ASEAN country to be a member of the Quad. And not all ASEAN countries are liberal democracies, obviously. When we talk about supply chains, like Vietnam is a very important partner in any supply chain resilience because of the literate and relatively inexpensive labor, displacing China as sort of a labor source. Vietnam is not a democracy. So I think what emerges in Asia is this patchwork of different types of organizations that will make up the architecture of Asia, and not sort of a single organization like an expansion of AUKUS or or an expansive Quad so that includes everybody against China. Like I just don't see that as a good outcome for Asia.
I wanted to quickly pivot, Dr. Cha, to South Korea's response under Moon to Russia, because we've seen a relatively strong response from Japan and Taiwan in the region to Russia. How would you characterize President Moon's response in South Korea under him?
The bumper sticker, I think, would be slow start, but worked hard to catch up. In the beginning, they really, in IR theory, we call it buck passing, right? They basically buck pass the threat to the United States and to other countries, essentially saying, we don't want to be involved. Like, we don't want to call out Russia. The President Moon would not call out Putin, made sort of vague statements about upholding sovereignty, largely because they didn't want to suffer the cost of like their energy supplies with Russia and things of that nature. But when they saw other countries like Japan, Australia, and others really taking a much more forward-leaning position, they tried to catch up. The nature of the war has changed now that it's largely being fought on the Eastern Front. The Biden administration is upping the ask of Congress significantly, and countries are starting to send not just humanitarian assistance and military assistance like helmets and vests and things, but actually starting to send lethal battle equipment. My personal view is that I think under Yoon, Korea should, and I've written about it, they should provide, because if there's any country in the world that should understand an unprovoked attack by another country and in which the world responded, it should be Korea, because that's exactly what happened to them in June 1950. So they should be out there, I think, as they have been in the past in peacekeeping operations in Southeast Asia. They were the third largest ground contingent in Iraq. I mean, they were in northern Iraq, which was, not as dangerous, but they were there. They have a world-class, first world, top-class military. Not that they would send troops to Ukraine, but they have lots of good equipment that they could send. And if Yoon wants to walk the walk of Korea pivoting to being a global player and not just obsessed with North Korea, then this would be a very strong signal and message to send that would gain the respect of the Europeans as well as others.
Now, I know you said that he should do this, and I'm going to ask you to dig into your crystal ball, or maybe have we seen any type of indications from the incoming administration that they will ratchet it up?
I think we've heard them say that they're significantly going to ratchet up assistance. But the question of whether they'll actually provide lethal equipment is, they have said nothing on that. I don't imagine they will. I imagine they might. We'll see again, he's inaugurated May 10th, and then the first summit meeting is with Biden May 21st. We'll see if something happens somewhere in there. But, Korea has lots of artillery. It has lots of ammunition. Like, they need ammunition in Ukraine. They have armored personnel carriers, which they have sold to Australia. So they have got good stuff, and they could make a significant contribution.
We've been mentioning how important the North Korea paradigm is to South Korean politics, but I want to know, will the new president coming in May 10th change the way the Biden administration is approaching the DPRK in a significant way, or do you think the U.S. will still be status quo, maybe not wanting to engage?
So I think that there will be some things that are the same, and then there'll be two things that will be different. The thing that will be the same will be the continued focus on denuclearization as the goal of the policy and an openness to negotiation, right? I mean, I think that's sort of the standing line. The problem is the North Koreans are not interested in negotiating right now because they're trying to reach their benchmarks in terms of their missile program in particular. The two things that will change, I think, is under Yoon, you will see much more cooperation with the United States on theater missile defense, because the North Korean missile threat is becoming more and more serious. Actually, I and a colleague wrote a piece about this in Foreign Affairs on Friday about the dangers to our national missile defense because of the growing North Korean missile threat, which is happening under our noses, but we're very focused on Ukraine, so we haven't been paying attention. So I think that there'll be much more cooperation on missile defense. The Moon government was very shy about doing that because they didn't want to upset China, because China doesn't like it when Korea participates with the United States on missile defense. And then the second will be on human rights, which nobody has really talked about. The Moon government very quietly, because of their engagement policy with North Korea, really tried to roll back all the human rights advocates for North Koreans in South Korea. NGOs, outspoken sort of leaders really tried to roll them back, cut their funding, make illegal some of the activities that we're doing. You're not going to see that under Yoon. And that's affected the Biden administration's policy because there is legislation in Congress that requires the White House to appoint an envoy for North Korean human rights abuses. Trump never did it, and the Biden administration, their first year, has not done it. And I think they didn't do it not because they don't care about North Korean human rights. I think they do. But they didn't appoint someone because the Moon government found it very awkward. Like the Moon government never appointed a North Korean human rights envoy either. I think the Yoon government is going to go in completely the opposite direction and talk about human rights abuses in North Korea and try to help the North Korean people. And then I think Biden will also appoint, per the North Korean Human Rights Act, will also appoint an envoy. And this will be the first time we've had an envoy for North Korean human rights since the Obama administration, which is, a long time ago.
Dr. Cha, when we're talking about South Korea, one thing that it's hard to overlook is South Korea's recent success as really a juggernaut in the global entertainment landscape. They've become one of the major exporters of music, with their popular music acts competing with Americans on the Billboard charts. They've become a very popular exporter of television, and they've also become a very popular exporter of movies, as we saw Parasite winning both the Cannes Film Festival and the American Academy Awards. Do you see Korea's success in the entertainment landscape reflected in its geopolitical position in any kind of concrete way?
I totally agree. I think for example, in classes at Georgetown, when we have students who are interested in Korean classes, traditionally you have one cohort, which are sort of heritage students, right? Korean Americans, Korean Canadians, Korean Brazilians, whoever they may be. But what you notice now is that they're actually the minority. Like the majority of the class that's interested in it are people who have no Korean heritage at all. And you ask them why, and it entirely has to do with the things you just mentioned. Korean music, Korean movies, Korean TV shows, Korean food. It is just like extremely popular all around the world, not just in the United States, but all over the world, right? These things are very popular. And so when we think of soft power, we largely think of it as this notion that it helps to elevate or allow a country to punch above its weight in global politics. And so, sure, I do think that the notion of Korea being, in quotation marks, cool, or Korea being seen as being on the cutting edge, whether you're talking about entertainment and culture, whether you're talking about sports, or whether you're talking about tech, high tech, right? I mean, half of everybody's phone and almost everybody's television is a Samsung phone, right? That I think that all does help to create the Korea brand that makes it more interesting. But that really doesn't translate to influence on the global stage unless Korea acts like a global player on the global stage. And unfortunately, over the past 5 years, we didn't have that because the focus under the Moon government was really on engagement with North Korea. That was the primary focus. But I think we're going to see a change with the Yoon government because, again, the focus is on repairing relationships like the one with Japan, participating more in some of these regional organizations like the Quad, increasing development assistance around the world, like 2 or 3 times an increase in their development assistance around the world to help people in Africa, to help people in Ukraine and elsewhere. When you have that sort of, on the policy side, when you have those sorts of policies, then I think the soft power can be mobilized to sort of amplify or accelerate or multiply the effect of the policies on a global stage. So it requires both of those things. It can't just be one of them.
The antiques of Korea's wealthy business families are making headlines again. Korean Air Senior Vice President Cho Hyun-min, daughter of the parent company's chairman, is under police investigation after throwing a tantrum and allegedly throwing a bottle of water at a business meeting. The alleged incident came to light just a few days after her elder sister, Cho Hyuna, who infamously delayed a flight back in 2014 because her macadamia nuts were served in a bag, not on a dish, made a comeback as the chief of the parent company's hotel business. It's another reported case of the heirs to Korea's family-run conglomerates or chaebols abusing their subordinates and subcontractors.
Chaebol management is often called emperor management because decision-making is top-down and leadership is passed down to their children. Unlike the first generation who were self-made businessmen, their children grow up like princes and princesses. They become executives with no checks or balances to evaluate their qualifications or ethics, which is problematic.
According to a 2015 survey by CEO Score,
We are now going to go to audience questions. So the first question is going to be from Andy. So over to you, Andy.
With the chaebols being such a dominant part, as you've said, of both the South Korean economy, but also of the fabric of their society, not just Samsung, but LG, just all these names. Is there a difference when it comes to the priorities, especially around foreign policy, when South Korea comes to the table? Is it fueled by different, priorities than perhaps, let's say, the US or the UK? And perhaps, if that's or terribly wrong and completely the answer is just a simple no, then perhaps we could maybe get your thoughts on whether you think the chaebols are actually a good thing, and about how they differ from Japan's keretsu, which are obviously less family-owned, but still very dominant in the fabric of the society. So many thanks indeed.
Great. Thanks for the question, Andy. So the comparison to Japan is instructive. So first of all, I do think that the progressive government under Moon was perceived to have very much of an anti-big business, anti-chaebol policy or posture. And that was certainly the view of the big conglomerates themselves, right? And I don't think that's the case with Yoon. I think that Yoon will, they're certainly not going to allow the chaebols to do whatever they want, the conglomerates to do whatever they want, but they're certainly not going to be known as an anti-big business type of government. That has its problems, obviously, because it reduces the ability of small and medium-sized enterprises to thrive, which is actually linked to innovation, because it's really innovation we see really comes from the small and the medium-sized, more nimble organizations, also not just in Seoul, but outside of Seoul. So it has these follow-on effects. But in relationship with business becomes much more important when we're talking about the number one pressing issue in the economic national security sphere, which is supply chains and resilient supply chains. The Yoon government has already said they're committed to naming a point person for economic security to basically deal with this new world in which we're living, where countries want to try to create resiliency, not in every sector, but in key sectors that matter, like tech, global health, things of that nature. And so this is where the difference between Japan and Korea comes in, because the Japanese have the same concern, and they've already established, a point person for economic security. And there is a pretty cooperative relationship between government and business when it comes to, investing in production of certain types of rare earth minerals or things of that nature. The government and the business work together pretty well in Japan. It's less so the case in Korea, right? In Korea, the government may want to tell the chaebols what to do, but they don't necessarily listen, right? In that sense, they're more like U.S. companies than they are like Japanese company. So Yoon is not going to be anti-big business. He's going to want to work with business, and he's going to particularly want to work with business when it comes to things like supply chain security.
All right. Thank you very much, Andy. We are going to go next to Nas. I think this is going to be our last question. So over to you, Nas.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Justin. Now, my question, lately I've been reading in the news that South Korea is expanding their military exports and manufacturing, especially with countries like Egypt. They sign a contract, multi-billion-dollar. How does the U.S. perceive that expansion of South Korea and the arms sales?
Yes, Korea wants to be more involved commercially in the arms export industry. As I mentioned earlier, they did a deal with Australia. They have a fighter trainer also that they want to sell as being part of other countries' air forces. So it's something that the Koreans are interested in. They certainly have the capabilities. They certainly have the technology. What they're very interested in doing is actually defense industrial cooperation and production jointly with the United States and the so-called primes in the United States, right? The big defense industry companies in the U.S. And from a U.S. perspective, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because whether we're talking about weapons or whether we're talking about civil nuclear energy or some of these other things, Korea generally maintains sort of and follows the norms and rules, Western-based standards, frankly, where Russia and China do not. So if a country like Korea is interested in doing more cooperation with the United States in these areas, that's a real possibility. Of course, it's not as easy as it sounds, because there's some technology that the United States, for example, does not want to share, even with close allies like South Korea. And so the question is, how do you cooperate in terms of co-production of things while blackboxing some of that key sensitive technology? But these were not so much issues under the Moon government because they didn't want to pursue them. But I think we'll see more of it happening under the Yoon government.
Thank you for that question, Nas and Andy. So, Dr. Cha, I want to thank you very much for coming on our show. But before we leave you, I'm wondering if you have any last thoughts, what we should be looking for in the U.S.-South Korea relationship and how it might change and evolve.
I would say there are two things that I think are important for our listeners to remember. And there are two things that are kind of under the radar screen right now. The first, again, as we wrote in Foreign Affairs on Friday, is that North Korea is on track, not tomorrow, but they are on track to defeat our national missile defense system based on the missiles that they're producing. Our missile defense system is a legacy system from the 1990s, and North Korea is on track to defeat it. And we're not, people in the Pentagon obviously are paying attention, but people more broadly aren't paying attention because we're all focused on Ukraine. The second thing is COVID in North Korea. North Korea is one of two countries that has no vaccines, has not vaccinated its population. And so there's a real concern that there could be, new subvariants that emerge out of North Korea because it's a population already that has all sorts of other medical problems because of a lack of medicine and a complete border shutdown for the last 2 years. So those are sort of two things that I would leave with listeners to watch, because they're not covered a lot in the media, but from an expert perspective, they're quite concerning.
That concludes today's conversation. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information about how to join us, our upcoming live schedule, and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Monday, featuring Tim Carney of the American Enterprise Institute. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, our co-founders. Thank you for being here. We hope to hear from you soon.